Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Every episode, we sit down to chat about the book read most recently by one of our book clubs. What did we make of it? Did it spark debate? And whether we loved it or loathed it, the big question is always, was it a great book club book?
Today we're talking about East West Street, a memoir by prominent barrister Philippe Sands, and Kate's latest book club book. It's a history of atrocity combined with a relentless search for the truth, as Sands digs deep into both his own family history and the legal framework that eventually brought Nazi war criminals to justice.
For our regular book club interview, we'll be talking to David Aronson, longtime member of an all-male book club. But does the fact that there are no women around affect their reading choices?
I think generally with fiction it's hard to separate, because I think a thoughtful writer will enter various genders and ages, and that's, I think, the point of being a writer, that you can take you to other places outside of yourself.
And we round all that off with some recommendations for your next book club book, inspired by East West Street.
That's all coming up here on the Book Club Review. Hi Laura.
Hi Kate.
Welcome to the shed on a chilled out Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, and it's feeling quite springy. Very nice. You still have a winter cold though.
I know. Sorry everyone. I had this horrible cold that's gone on for ages. But so I thought, the cold, harsh months of January and February would be a great time to read a memoir about atrocity and
the Holocaust.
Nazi war crimes.
Thanks for that.
Little post-Christmas.
So this was your choice, East West Street.
Choice. Yeah, I brought it to the book club. I just kept hearing how good it was from various people. And I'd actually picked it up in the bookshop myself and kind of glanced at it and sort of put it down again, because I just thought, oh God, there's so many words. Quite dense, tight, not much space around the edge of the pages.
Lots of endnotes.
Yeah, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that I would enjoy it. But then I was in Paris, actually. I was in a bookshop there and I saw it and I thought, this is a good chance to catch up with that. And so I read it and I was very struck by it, and I thought, this would be a really interesting book club. And then I actually mentioned it to the others. And they were quite up for it. Yeah,
well, that's impressive. So January and February were spent reading, or in my case, listening to East West Street. What did everyone think of it?
Funnily enough, it is actually, well, it'd be interesting to know if you found it the same, but I was surprised at how readable it is. But it's quite a difficult book to sum up. And actually I thought, who better to sum it up than the author himself? So here is Philippe Sands telling us what East West Street is about.
It's been a long time in the writing, and it began with an invitation I received in the spring of 2010 to deliver a public lecture on my work as an academic and as a practicing lawyer, a barrister, on international crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity. I spent the summer researching that subject. I'd accepted to give the lecture for another, more personal reason. My grandfather was born in the city when it was called Lemberg in 1904. Later it became Lvov. And I just wanted to know what had happened to him there and what had happened to his family. I spent a summer doing research, and I came across an extraordinary coincidence. The man who put the concept of genocide into international law, its inventor, was Raphael Lemkin. And he attended the university that had invited me. And then I discovered that the man who put the concept of crimes against humanity into the Nuremberg Statute and international law, Hirsch Lauterpacht, had also come from the same city and attended the same university. So I went off to Lviv in October 2010, and there I came across a fourth man, Hans Frank. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer in the late 1920s. Later he became Governor General of occupied Poland, and from 1941, Governor General of Lviv and Galicia. And there he unleashed the final solution with a speech he gave in August 1942. My book, East West Street, tells the story of these four lives, their strange, interweaving connections, culminating in the remarkable trial at Nuremberg.
His voice is very familiar to me because he reads those chapters that really delve into his own family history, and then it switches to another narrator on the audiobook. Yeah, so
Oh, that sounds good. I've listened to quite a few lectures that he's given or, book events, and he's actually quite a mesmerising speaker. It doesn't take any leap of the imagination at all, actually, to imagine him sort of standing in front of a packed courtroom with the gown and wig and declaiming. Let me just read a tiny bit from the book. I was going to read actually just from the very beginning, because I think if I'd picked this up and read the beginning in the bookshop, I actually would have been hooked. Whereas as it was, I sort of picked up and looked in the middle and was a bit daunted. So let me tell you how it starts. Tuesday the 1st of October, 1946, Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. A little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the wooden door behind the defendant's dock slid open, and Hans Frank entered courtroom 600. He wore a grey suit, a shade that was offset by the white helmets worn by the 2 sombre-faced military guards, his escorts. The hearings had taken a toll on the man who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, and then personal representative in German-occupied Poland, with his pink cheeks, sharp little nose, and slicked-backed hair. Frank was no longer the slender and swank minister celebrated by his friend Richard Strauss. Indeed, he was in a considerable state of perturbation, so much so that as he entered the room he turned and faced in the wrong direction, showing his back to the judges. And so this is the man who ultimately will become the focal point at the end of the book. So this book is sort of anchored by this structure where it takes you through the histories of these 4 different figures: Leon, Sands' grandfather, Hirsch Lauterpacht, Raphael Lemkin, the 2 lawyers, and then Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland, who was Hitler's personal lawyer, and he was ultimately found responsible for the
crimes and the murders of these 3 men's families.
Yes,
who didn't manage
in addition to
escape.
so many others, but significantly crimes against humanity, which is what he was convicted of. And so there's this personal history going on the one hand, and then there's this legal story on the other hand, that is where Lauterpacht and Lemkin come into play, because they argued for the inclusion of 2 different terms. Lauterpacht wanted crimes against humanity to be a recognised legal term, and Lemkin wanted genocide to be a recognised legal term. And both men fought in different ways from different sides. Lauterpacht was working for the British, Lemkin was working for the Americans.
And I'd say for himself. He was a bit of a rogue agent.
Yeah. So they had very much had their personal agendas.
We should say the distinction, so that crimes against humanity was about crimes against the individual, whereas genocide would be crimes against a group. And Lauterpacht was very much against having a legal framework for convicting people for crimes against the group, because he thought that it could lead to complications. And Philippe Sands, did you not get the sense throughout that he's really on Lauterpacht's side, that he actually didn't think that genocide was the term that should be used in a court of law for the crimes? So it's all a bit confusing, because I was thinking, Lemkin, the fact that we still use both terms, but genocide is such a potent term, I think, and means so much more to people when they hear it than crimes against humanity. I thought maybe Lemkin had sort of been vindicated, because he's actually not nearly as well respected as Lauterpacht.
Well, it's quite sort of nuanced aspects of legal argument and what you can prosecute and what you can prove. And I think we're very familiar with these terms, but there was a time in the not too distant past when these terms didn't exist.
And not only did they not exist, there was no legal framework, but also there was no kind of human conception that the state, a sovereign state, could be held responsible for any crimes they inflicted on their own population.
Yes, and I think this, in a way, more than anything else, is what you can tell Sands is really passionate about. I think that sense of the importance of the fact that the state is brought to recognise that it is responsible for its citizens and that it cannot just treat them with impunity.
And that the state is made up of real human beings who can be prosecuted for those crimes.
Yeah, the government, effectively.
This is all sounding perhaps a bit kind of legal.
Dry.
Yes. Yeah. So I think what makes this book really wonderful is the interweaving of the personal and then the historical record. So yes, the courtroom and this legal framework that came into being, but the family stories of both Philippe Sands' grandfather.
The effect that the events of the war had on his family.
Yeah.
And I mean, to put that into perspective, Sands' grandfather, Leon, when he lived in Lemberg, he was a member of a family that encompassed around 80 members.
Yeah.
After the war, Leon was the only surviving member of that family.
Yeah.
And his is not an isolated story. There's a kind of universal experience there that I think also Sands is tapping into.
Yeah.
Through focusing on his own grandfather, he's able to kind of explain the story that must have happened to the majority of Jewish families who were in that situation.
Yeah, 6 million.
And so it's heavy stuff.
But it's not relentless.
Well, that's
you know, there's moments when I'd kind of be walking through the streets of London on my commute, and there'd be a story, and I'd just be like, oh my god, you know, just like hits you in the chest. But then other moments, you know, it's just interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, he is professionally a barrister. He's not a writer. But what I loved about this book and what I thought was so extraordinary was the quality of detachment that he brings to this story. And that enables you to work through some really quite kind of distressing, challenging material sometimes, because you're always aware of the greater picture, this sense that although these events were happening to individuals and that it was just catastrophic and lives were destroyed or people were displaced or, you know, so much suffering, but the larger picture, which he's also interested in, is this sense of this development of this legal framework so that actually there can be a sense of justice and that people can be held accountable.
Yeah.
And that's so compelling. I mean, that story, I would describe this book as a page-turner because of the way that story is told. And you never lose sight of what it's building towards. And then this trial at the end, the Nuremberg trial, is the sort of culmination of the threads of argument, you know, in the sort of legal terms that have been going on. You finally see them in action. And actually, ultimately, it's almost slightly disappointing, certainly for Lemkin, because he didn't manage to get the word genocide included in those judgments. They used the term crimes against humanity. And it's only as recently as 1998, I was reading, that after Rwanda and also Yugoslavia, they formed the International Criminal Court that then prosecuted for the crime of genocide.
It was getting, that bit at the end did get a bit fuzzy to me, because they did say that there was a UN resolution kind of within a year, I think, that recognised genocide, but there was a massive delay by different countries not signing it. So I think 1998 was at the moment when...
First person to be prosecuted, which was Jean-Paul Akayesu, became the first person ever to be convicted of the crime of genocide.
How did you and the book club feel about his digging into his own family history? Because I always kind of struggle with the ethics of that. I just think, you know, if you know, this is your own family, you know your grandparents, and they never told you these stories, you know, what sort of right do you have to go digging into the stories they didn't want to tell you in the first place?
Yes, and it's interesting that he had to wait until his grandfather died before he was really able to start exploring properly. We talked about what Sands himself acknowledges, which is that there is a kind of tacit understanding amongst people of that generation that these things are not to be spoken of. You know, they experienced what they experienced. They survived. Some of them were lucky enough to escape. Some of them sort of survived the situations that they were in. But that they all sort of lived through horrors and that they would not discuss them, because why would you? You know, these are sort of terrible things to talk about. But as a result, it means that it's left to Sands' generation, if they want to kind of go back and try and figure out what happened. And that was really interesting. I think that sort of sense of the detective story and trying to uncover the evidence. You know.
His research is incredible.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
And he had a lot of resources too, because he had research assistants helping him out. And
who all seem to be happy to work for him for free. Like,
well, I don't know.
He's obviously quite a persuasive individual.
I wouldn't have been surprised if he had a grant or other resources. I just had the sense that this was such an undertaking for him. And it is incredible work just in that sense, the stories that he manages to tell.
Yeah,
you know,
we all
feels
felt
like history is almost being not written but found, you know, excavated.
Yeah, a masterclass in research gathering and then presenting that in a really compelling way. I think we all agreed that. But two of the members of my book club actually are barristers, and one of them, I think, had the kind of issue about the kind of personal aspect of this story and whether it was almost, yes, as you say, like too much, that perhaps we're bringing up things that would be better left unsaid,
or at least perhaps be more respectful left unsaid.
Yeah,
that I always sort of feel that way about, you know, your grandparents' lives. You know them as elderly people, and if they don't want to tell you all of their life story, well, that's their prerogative.
Yeah, it was interesting as well that they also liked the legal side. Obviously, they were
Did
very
they?
interested in that. But that they actually would have liked more detail.
Oh, really?
Really? And they were like, well, yeah, you know, when he gets to this point, he sort of is a little bit glib about, you know, he explains quite comprehensively, you know, one side's arguments, but then he a little bit glosses over the arguments of the other side. And
so
they kind of wanted it. It's almost like they wanted it to be more rigorous. I mean, I felt like for the general reader,
yeah.
Amanda put it very nicely, actually. She said, you know, it was just this marvellous mix of, you know, personal and historical and sort of memoir and just enough lore for my taste.
It makes me think Philippe Sands is either very kind of self-aware of non-lawyers' interest in legal matters or had an excellent editor.
Yeah, I think he did. I think this book was very well edited. Again, I saw him talk and he said that he had originally written the book chronologically. And when he presented it to the publisher, the editor turned around and said, okay, we're prepared to publish this book, but this is how you're going to structure it. You're going to separate these stories out. You're going to present them one by one. And then by the time the reader comes to the trial, they will then have the background to be able to really understand the kind of arguments that you want them to focus on. And I thought that worked brilliantly. So obviously Sands wrote it, but I think, hats off
there
to
is some shaping.
His good editor.
So was it a good book club book?
It was a great book club book because there was so much to talk about. And I think that sense that this felt like a really important book to read because there's this sense right now here in the UK with Brexit, there's a sense that these things that were set in place that came out of an appalling period of international history, you know, world wars and pain and suffering. And from that were born these ideals about a better way to treat people. And it's like we've kind of in danger of forgetting. And I think if this is anything, this book, it's a sort of rallying cry for the law and about remembering why that matters and why we must preserve it and why it's important. And Liz, one of the barristers, said, yeah, I was totally re-inspired about the law. It was great. But you do feel a bit like that. You feel like, yes, you know, the law, it's so great. So I'm the poster boy for being a lawyer.
Oh, good.
I should say it would be perhaps remiss of me, and he would be, I'm sure, outraged if I left out his comments that Andy, in my book club, who often has a contrary view, was not a fan. He said that he felt he wasn't really interested enough in the 3 personal stories.
Really?
And he didn't learn enough. So on both counts for him, it sort of it failed. But very interestingly, we'll talk about this again perhaps when we come to the recommendations. An obvious kind of counterpoint to this book is the book by Edmund de Waal, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, which similarly is a non-writer, in this case a potter, who is going back through his own family history and exploring what happened to that family during the war. And then the focus is it's through these objects, these netski, these wooden carvings that allow him to sort of trace the history. So there was something of that sense of the way of kind of approaching a subject. But to my mind, the Edmund de Waal was so much more subjective than this and more kind of poetic and beautiful in a way. I mean, de Waal's writing is quite extraordinary. This book didn't have that. It had a kind of clarity to it and a sort of deft touch that I absolutely loved. But interestingly, Andy much preferred Hare with Amber Eyes. He said he loved that.
Interesting.
And so I think it just partly depends on your taste as a reader. I love that sense of the author's mind, that kind of clarity of thought, that intensity of purpose. I really enjoyed all that. I mean, that for me was the thing that kept me eagerly turning the pages. I could see if you didn't particularly enjoy that and you were looking for something more sort of lyrical from the language or the prose, then yes, you know, this is probably not for you. So again, a good reason for making it a good book club book, because it was a little bit divisive and there was lots to say.
I love reading it, so thank you for choosing it for your book club.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I was very happy to have read it and I was very happy that the others did too. Now, here on this show, we are fascinated by other people's book groups. We've interviewed plenty of all-female groups, but never one made up exclusively of men. David Aronson took time out of his teaching day to talk to me about friendships, expanding his reading horizons, and whether there is such a thing as a manly book. He began by telling me about the book club's origins.
I wasn't at the start of the book club, but I think it's been going for about 14 years. I've been going for about 11 years, and it was started by 2 men who were friends, who were both lawyers. So we're made of 7 men. We are all white middle-class men. and the bourgeoisie. We meet at different houses 4 to 5 times a year. The rules, which are kind of unwritten, are that each house will provide the food, which is a sort of dinner or after dinner delicious repast, and the person who's hosting it will then suggest the books for the next group. People generally talk about themselves, their families, their relationships, and then talk about the book. And in fact, the most interesting thing about the group is it is a thoughtful, engaging men's group. And in the period that I've been a member, the kind of tragedies that happened in Tolstoy and Dostoevsky have happened to everybody's life. Death of parents, ill children, divorces, loss of jobs. And these things are all addressed in a gentle, supportive way.
We've interviewed lots of different book clubs on our show. They either tend to be female-led or they're mixed, but the majority is female. So it's very intriguing to find a group that's all men. Is that a conscious choice on your part?
I think it is a conscious choice now. I don't know what I would imagine male conversation to be like, but it's not competitive. If I would think of stereotypes, it's not overtly locker room, sexual, diners club conversation. It tends to be thoughtful, relaxed and supportive. And I suppose there is something nice about being in an all-male group.
And do you read particular genres or are you open to anything?
What's nice about any book group, I imagine, is that the book group is some of its members, so people come with their own ideas and choices. I like dead authors because I feel that when authors are alive, there's lots of PR and money put into making authors famous on the top shelf. Some people have particular obsessions. One member's obsessed with Philip Ross, somebody likes J.M. Coetzee, so it will always come up. J.G. Ballard often comes up. I had an idea that I wanted to read all the Nobel Prize winning authors because a lot of these books are out of fashion, and I did get people to read Haldor Laxness' novel.
I'm not familiar with the work of what's his name? Haldor Laxness.
Haldor Laxness, who won the Nobel Prize, wrote Under the Glacier, which is a sort of 1960s Nordic magic realist novel.
And did that make for a good book club book?
It was a good book club book. It wasn't really narrative driven. It was a visual book, quite a thoughtful novel with some surprising surrealist imagery towards the end. It was unusual. We weren't used to reading that kind of thing.
Talk me through some of the things that you've read, maybe some of the things that have stood out for you over the years.
We read Orhan Pamuk, which is full of description and poetry, and for me, I wanted more of a story. Other people were very engaged by it. Blindness by Jose Saramago is a very interesting novel. It's a surreal political novel, a moral fable, very strong illustration. J.G. Ballard is very engaging but repetitive. Apologies to Ballard fans. In his dystopian visions, House of Mr. Biswas by Nepal was a very interesting novel that took me to an area I'd never heard of in India. Dostoevsky's Big Hero of Mine, we read The House of the Dead, which is a terribly miserable novel. The book group introduced me to my Antonia Willa-Cather, who was a fabulous writer. It's a very gentle, I hate to use the word, feminine book, but it's a gentle, thoughtful, engaging novel. Poetic, light, but also firm, a bit like Elizabeth Gaskell. She seems to have a similar handle in her way of writing. Books that really made me think were Life, a User's Manual by George Perec. It's an extraordinary novel through its complication. It's setting out for a conceptual piece of art. It's like 1,000 villages, some more beautiful than others, that's put together in a large, ranging novel.
I tried to read that and I found myself a bit daunted. I wonder if it'd be too much for a book club. There's a lot going on in that book.
There is a prejudice on short books for busy people. So in the book club, the harder workers like books that are about 250 pages. So when books are looked up, books that are too long are often, there's a kind of a vote, but everybody enjoyed Life, a User's Manual, though it's a big, long book. I mean, the problem with Perec is that there are lots of vignettes, and it's not a big story like Buddenbrooks. There are lots of small vignettes that are beautiful and brilliant, but it doesn't hang together as one big book. And if you're looking for that, it's not going to work.
Do you think there's such a thing as a manly book?
I think we're not very manly men. I'm not sure what a manly book would be. I think books that would be over manly, over, I don't know, sexual, violent, authoritative, then I would think of Nicholas Roeg's film Performance when the two guys are beating each other up. But underneath the violence, there's a feeling of homosexuality and sexuality, so it would question what manliness is anyway. If manliness in the book group is about the people in the book group who I had never met before, most of them, only one of them, I would consider, having met them at least 40 times now, to be friends, to be people who I would help or would help me if I needed help, and who I would like to spend time with. And I'm not sure if that's a male or female version of friendship. And in terms of response to literature, I think generally with fiction it's hard to separate, because I think a thoughtful writer will enter various genders and ages, and that's, I think, the point of being a writer, that you can take you to other places outside of yourself. So it take you to a child's body, or a woman's body, or a transgender body, or whatever that is, or someone from another country.
You're obviously someone who reads a lot anyway. What is it you get from this book club that makes you want to carry on going? You've been at it a long time.
The friendships, the people, the range of literature, other people's thoughts on literature, a wider range of looking at literature than I would get from the top 100 list, because the people who are suggesting the books I know, and it's an extension of their chance reading or something they've discovered or something they're passionate and interested about. So everyone in the book group suggests some of the books come from something that has been very important to them. So I think that's what's given to me. It's broadened my range of literature, it's broadened my friendships, and maybe it's broadened my understanding of manliness.
Your book club sounds great, but if I wanted to join, I wouldn't be able to. What would you say to me?
I think it's quite nice to have a male-only space, really, though that's not in a written rule, so I'm sure you'd be allowed to come along. But I think it probably is, actually. I have a wife and 2 daughters, so I live in a world of women, and I suppose it's quite nice sometimes to be in a male space, and I'm not sure how I would define a male space, as I've tried earlier. I'm not sure how. But you'd be welcome to come along.
David, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy teaching day to talk to me about your book club.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to all the members of my book group, who happen to be male, who are good fun and have introduced me to some really good literature.
I heard it described, your book group, as a book club that as yet has no women members.
Yes, that's right. As yet has no women members. That's the kind of liberal book club we are, and I'm sure that women members would be welcome.
It may remain that way for a long time, though, waiting for women members.
I really love the idea of an all-male book club.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Actually, I didn't explain before the interview, but David is a teacher at Camden School for Girls, which is a very large, very well-established girls' school here in North London. And so not only is he surrounded by women in his home life, his wife and 2 daughters, he's surrounded by women in his professional life. And I think very much this is a school as well. You know, I wasn't there very long when I went to meet him, but, there's a real sense that the girls who are there are encouraged to be forthright and opinionated and stand up for themselves. And
yeah, absolutely.
So
I don't think it's funny, because like you can have an all-woman book club. There is a double standard. An all-woman book club, you think, oh yes, of course, why wouldn't women want to just gather in their own space?
But is it an elective choice for an all-woman? Because I feel like so often actually all-women book club, it's just because they haven't actually been able to find any men.
No, I think more often it's a choice. I do. I think it's a choice.
You don't think it's just that men who are in book clubs are in short supply?
I
have one man in my book club. I would love, if you're a man and you want to join a lively mixed group in North London, I'd love you to come to my, because I used to have 2, and sadly both of them.
And then you had
moved away.
3,
and
briefly.
Yeah, it's got. But I mean, I love the mix,
and I do too, because I have 2 men in my book club as well. But that said, when there are no men there, and certain issues might come up, or maybe the conversation just changes, there is something to be said for the kinds of conversations you will only have with other women, just because we have such different experiences. And I think sure that's the same for men, that they have different experiences too, and of course they should have their own space to come together and sit down. I love that they read fiction as well, because I do have this stereotype that men mainly read non-fiction.
Yes, as I understand, they exclusively read fiction. They don't read anything else.
And what a list.
I did think, yes, I was sort of teasing a little bit at the end about, well, I'd love to come along. And he was obviously then, well, of course you could. But at the same time, did you sense there, obviously he is a bit protective of it. I think they all would be. And I don't think actually they would want a woman coming in.
I think that's fine, because I think there would be lots of women book clubs that don't want any men coming in, because actually they're going to talk about things that they wouldn't talk about if there was a man there.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm not a man, so I don't know what kind of things men talk about. But there's just certain vulnerabilities, I think, that you are more willing to expose among your own gender.
I mean, it was interesting as well. It was a great list of books that they'd done. But I mean, he himself had done a little tally, and I think, what was it, sort of 80 books or something like that. And I think, 72 of them were by male authors and 8 of them were by female authors. And, so you'd have to say that there was a certain bias in the selection towards what is maybe a bit of a stereotypical idea about what men like to read, but, great books written by men. But nonetheless,
classics.
I agree with him when he said that the job of a fiction writer is to take you into the mind of these different characters, irrespective of their gender or the gender of the characters that they're writing about. And that's more my experience of reading. I feel like reading is, in a way, sort of genderless. It's really about whether it's any good or not.
Yeah.
That's the thing that matters.
He said that they only read dead authors, so maybe we should suggest Two Serious Ladies to them.
Oh my goodness, can you imagine? Well, for any listeners who wish to know why we think that's so funny, you should go back and check out our episode on Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles. Very
peculiar,
book club
distinctive book. Inspired by East West Street, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read.
Well, the obvious point of comparison is the Hare with Amber Eyes, Edmund de Waal's best-selling book that traces his own family history. The Ifrusis were a once great banking family, sort of fabulously wealthy and powerful. And then after the war, they had effectively been destroyed, and the only thing that was left of their vast empire were these tiny Japanese carvings, this collection of 264, I think, netsuke, as they're called. And de Waal is an artist, he's a potter by trade. He was fascinated by these objects, and he decided to look back and trace their history, and in doing so uncovered this extraordinary family story. It's very compelling, it's beautifully written, and for me it's more a book where the pleasure is in the language and the way it's written, and the netsuke. That story is fascinating about these little Japanese carvings, juxtaposed with this family history about the war and the terrible events that befell Jewish families, no matter what their status. It was a very good book club book because it was quite divisive. Some people really responded to that language and poetry, but then, perhaps like me, found the way the story was told a little bit frustrating, whereas others, I think, just sort of loved the story and the way that he brought it to life. And we did it quite a long time ago for my book club, and it was a very good discussion book, so I would recommend that. And I also thought I'd recommend a book called In the Garden of Beasts by an American author called Erik Larson. We read another book of his called The Devil in the White City. It's non-fiction, but I've written here a note. It's history that reads like a thriller. He is a great storyteller. And I went on to read In the Garden of Beasts because I wanted to read something else by him. And that covers the American ambassador in the embassy in Berlin in the years just prior to the declaration of World War II, and the rise of Hitler and this man's sort of presence in that city and his observations of the things that were going on around him. And it's absolutely brilliant the way, like Sands, it's just extraordinary, the kind of scholarship, the research, and then the compelling way that he weaves it all together to tell this story. If you want something that's going to bring history to life before your eyes, then In the Garden of Beasts by Erik Larson.
I have two recommendations for you, both by the Austrian writer Robert Seethaler. The first is The Tobacconist, and I have recommended this book before, but it is really that good. I think since I did, you've read it, Kate, haven't you?
I read A Whole Life. I haven't read The Tobacconist.
Well, all right, I can have an opportunity to sell it to you again.
Yeah.
Like A Whole Life, it is a very short novel, and it's very precisely written, translated into English. And it's the story of a young Austrian boy who leaves the mountain lakes where he's grown up with his mother and gets a job as an assistant to a tobacconist. And he arrives in Vienna in the years immediately preceding Anschluss, when Hitler and the German army moved in. It's a coming-of-age story as he expands his horizons and, in fact, befriends Sigmund Freud, who comes into the shop to buy his cigarettes. And he's just a young boy, really, but all of these events are happening around him. And the tobacconist who he works for is taking a stand, I think, in a way that thousands of people did, hundreds of thousands of people did in their own small way, in the face of this wave of Nazi persecution and oppression. And it doesn't end happily, as, you know, East West Street makes so clear for the characters and for millions of other people like them. But it's very moving and it's very beautiful, and I think it would be a great book club book. The other book, A Whole Life, which was his first book translated into English, which was kind of his breakout novel in English, it tells the story of one man's whole life. I
loved A Whole Life.
In you know, the Austrian mountains. And the reason why I bring it up in relation to East West Street as well is because that character, this unassuming man, it's his whole life, but it's a very small life, except he gets conscripted into the army, you know, and sent off to the Russian front. And his life is of no importance whatsoever to the Nazi powers either. It's another point of reference for this time in European history, and it's very powerful, as is The Tobacconist. You could even read both for your book club because they are quite short.
And for our bookseller recommendation,
I talked to Henry Late, owner of the Book Hive in Norwich. He gave me 2 great book club suggestions and also a mini masterclass in what running an independent bookshop is all about. Henry, how long has it been since you set up the Book Hive?
It has been now 8.5 years.
And in that time, I imagine you've recommended many a book to your customers. Can you pull out a good book club recommendation from your archive?
The one that I wanted to do, in a way, which I always do, is Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road. But I'm not going to do that because it is quite well known, and all I'm just going to say is go and read it. Just read it. Everyone should read it. The book I'm going to choose came out at the end of last summer, maybe autumn time. September, October perhaps. Heather the Totality by Matthew Weiner. It's a slim little volume. It's a novella. You know, when you look on the back here, Michael Chabon has said, I hear echoes of Flaubert and Richard Yates. And I think it's no coincidence that I'm such a huge fan of Richard Yates and this book. Anyone who loves that sparse, typically American, I think, dry but razor-sharp observation will love this book. The subject is about a young woman from a well-off family in New York, and she is one of those extraordinary people who radiates attention. People want to be near her. They gravitate towards her. She's beautiful, but she's also beguiling and fascinating and talented and la 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 la. She's Heather of the title. And it's her sort of relationship as she naively goes through the world, not realising how dangerous that is, that quality. And we also follow the person who is her stalker. It's written by Matthew Weiner, who lots of people will know, even if they don't know his name. He wrote Mad Men, the TV series Mad Men. It's his first novel, and it's a brilliant piece of writing.
That sounds like a great recommendation, thank you. I'm not familiar with his work at all. And tell me a little bit about the Book Hive. I know why I think it's special. It's because I come here and everywhere I look, I just see wonderful books, kind of carefully curated edits of things that are just make me want to pick them up and read them. And also every time I have a conversation with someone who works here, I come away with sort of 12 different things that I think I want to read. But what are you trying to achieve here? What's your aim?
Well, they're the things that I think a bookshop should do, that when you come into a place like this, you shouldn't necessarily be coming in. It's interesting, we were talking about this World Book Day thing today, that there's this report that suggested, I can't remember what, 12% or maybe 20-something% of people feel uncomfortable in bookshops. And why would that be? I think it's if you don't know perhaps about books, you haven't been brought up around books, but you're being told that it's a good thing to read and it's a good thing to encourage children to read. If you go into Waterstones, say, I'm not just knocking on Waterstones, but it's a big supermarket-style shop. If you go in there, it is a completely overwhelming experience. The point of a place like this is that you should be able to walk in and just trust that everything in here is here for a reason. It's a kind of mise-en-scène of books in a way, is that it's been put here for a reason, and that the people who work here should know what that reason is. If you come in and say, have you got any books about golf? We'll just say no. And there is a reason for that as well. Not that I hate golf. I mean, I know nothing about it. But because of that, there wouldn't be any point in us having them, because if you choose books for a reason, because they're good, you should know something, I think, about them. The point is that you should be able to come here, and it's not that we're going to kind of revel in our expertise. It's just that this is hopefully an exercise in taste, by which I don't mean to be snobbish, I don't mean to be dismissive of other stuff, but this is a shop that only has 5 different areas that it stocks, and we want to get the best in those areas, or the most interesting, or the most surprising. But frankly, there are too many books published nowadays. That's a big problem across the publishing industry and for authors. There are too many books published. There's so much out there that it's more important than ever, I think, to have shops like this which hopefully will filter out the good stuff.
And you don't have a book club as part of the shop, do you? But I know that you do run these nights where people are encouraged to come and just read here in the space of the shop.
The Page Against Machine, which was Joe's initiative, Joe, who's worked here for nearly a year, was again as a result of some stats that were out about people not finding enough time to read. So it's different from a book club because people can come in and they just use the space to read. You know, they don't have to buy books. They can bring their own books. They drink wine and they sit and read. We don't have a book club. We've been involved in city book clubs for years, but actually we haven't for a while, and we were discussing this, that we're probably going to set up our own book club soon, possibly one on a boat, because there's a river next to us, and we thought it'd be quite fun to sit on a boat and float up and down, drinking gin and talking about books.
Book club on a boat, I love it, I'm sold. Henry, thanks so much for talking to me.
That's all for today. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club Revue Pod, that's RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts?
Books recommended in this episode were The Hare with Amber Eyes by Edmund de Waal, In the Garden of Beasts by Erik Larson, The Tobacconist and A Whole Life by Robert Seethaler. Standout books from David's book club were Under the Glacier by Haldor Laxness, Blindness by Jose Saramango, A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, and Life, A User's Manual by Georges Perec. You can find out more about The Book Hive at their website thebookhive.co.uk, where you'll find a lovely quote from Amor McBride, author of the incredible A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, that says, "The Book Hive is a wonder for both books and the soul. Everyone should go there, often." Henry's recommendations were Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates and Heather, A Totality by Matthew Weiner. And keep listening for our extra bit at the end, where we discuss what else we've been reading lately. A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor, Towles, My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell, Solar Bones by Mike McCormack, and a quick run-through of the Bailie Gifford non-fiction prize winners.
On our next episode, we'll be discussing Swing Time by Zadie Smith, which is my next book club read.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.
Ba-da-ba-da-da-ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da.
That's so good.
Well, that was pretty good, wasn't it?
Have you been practicing?
No, but
In the shower?
I decided not to be abashed. Just embrace my rhythmic recall.
That's definitely your best yet.
Thank you.
So what else have you been reading?
I have been reading Gerald Durrell's My Life.
Gerald Durrell?
I think that's his name.
I don't know why. I've never heard it said out loud by anyone, but I've always just assumed it was Durrell.
I don't know. I'm not British. Durrell.
But was
I
he?
think
He was
it is-
British, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, a standard English pronunciation of D-U-R-R-E-L-L would be Durrell.
Okay. So let's start again.
I think we should keep that.
I have been reading Gerald
Durrell.
a name that I've never encountered in my life in Britain or before in Canada. My Family and Other Animals, which is a classic about his childhood on the island of Corfu. Have you read this?
Shamefully, I've never read it. I think it's one of those books where I feel like I have, but I'm not sure I have.
Well, we're going to go to Greece, I think, in September and do a hiking trip and then retreat to Corfu or maybe to Paxos. And so I picked it up at Daunt Books. And I met Emily of the Walking Book Club.
Oh.
And that was very nice.
Yes.
Hi, Emily. So I picked that up and I'm just really enjoying it. It's a really slow read. I'm always slow reading nonfiction, but it's very funny. He's 10 years old when he arrives and he's a budding naturalist, and he would go on to be the David Attenborough, I think, of like the 60s and 70s. So he's either describing all of his siblings who were in their 20s. He was the youngest, and then his siblings were in their 20s, and then it was just his mom. And they moved to Corfu.
Sort of bonkers family.
They're quite bonkers, yes. His brother, Lawrence Durrell, became
Durrell. It's fine.
I heard
it might even be right for all I know.
I've heard him name drop recently about kind of Egyptian literati, I think in the 1950s, and that milieu, Lawrence Durrell was not Egyptian, but was a very prominent literary figure.
Yeah, he wrote the Alexandria Quartet.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Which Sally is always recommending to me, and I've managed to read half of. It's 4 novels. Justine, Balthazar, can't remember. And I managed to get about halfway through Justine, I think, before sort of slightly pathetically giving up.
Oh, really?
I was so disappointed because normally I love long, immersive novels, and I had really thought I was going to be completely captured by this. And also Sally's usually very good for a recommendation.
Yeah. This well-known author, Lawrence Durrell, in his brother's book is just this kind of obnoxious, slightly overweight character who has invites all his friends around and makes them move villas so that they have more space. It's really fun. It's lovely.
Would it be good for a book club book?
No, it'd be terrible for a book club book.
It's too likeable. Everyone would
It's just too likeable.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot about insects and toads and geckos, and that sounds boring, but the way he talks about it's more like reporting on epic battles between a mantid and a gecko. I mean, it's funny stuff.
So more a good book for January.
And for getting you ready for your summer holiday.
Yeah. I read A Gentleman in Moscow by
you?
Amor. Now you see, you'll be able to get your revenge on me because I have no idea how to pronounce Towles.
I think it might be
Towles?
oh no, it wouldn't be Towles.
Towles?
Towles. Did you like it?
You had recommended to me Rules of Civility.
Did you read that?
I bought and started and didn't hugely get on with, so I sort of put it to one side.
Come on.
But I was sort of much more attracted by this idea of this novel about an aristocrat who effectively gets sentenced to house arrest in a luxury hotel in Moscow and then lives out the next decades of his life, sort of 50 years in this hotel. And I thought, oh, that sounds maybe more my thing.
Yeah.
So I started to read that, and it's funny because it doesn't have a lot of narrative drive to it. And the thing about Towles I really love is that there are these just genius sentences. So every so often there'll just be this sentence and you'll just be like, oh, that's so great. Like the way he's expressed it, or the idea behind it, or the way that he's, managed to kind of articulate something in a way that you haven't thought of before. It's really, there's such a pleasure in that. But then the rest of the time, it's just sort of well written, chugs along, and I found it quite put downable. It didn't have a lot of kind of, as I say, narrative drive. There wasn't anything really pulling me through it.
I have started it, and maybe like 30, 40 pages in, and just thought,
But then, funnily enough, it is well written, and you do get increasingly absorbed.
Okay.
And I have to say it has a very good ending, which impressed me. And then I read a little bit more about it, and it turns out it's one of those books, a bit like Eleanor Catton's The Luminaries, that has this incredibly artful structure.
Oh, really?
It's like it starts with 3 pages, and then it goes to 5, and then 7, and then,
Why
and
do
it's all...
authors do this?
It is kind of odd, because I think in their own mind it's sort of, oh, this will be such a great way of structuring the book. But when you read it, you're not really aware of that.
No.
And all you're aware of is that this thing just doesn't really seem to have much pace.
Yeah. Does it pick up?
I think the novel really kind of suffers from that in a way. But at the same time, another idea that he said that kind of informed his writing was the idea of the book being like a diamond, where it starts at this sort of point and then gradually it kind of tapers it into all these different facets. And all of the different characters and aspects of the hotel kind of come to life. And then it tapers down again to this very focused ending. And that I thought was very good and brilliant. Yeah. And once I'd finished it, I thought, oh yeah, I really appreciate that. And also this hotel, the Metropole in Moscow, which is a real hotel. And if you look at Amor Towles' website, you can see he's done a kind of history of the building. And that actually was kind of magical. And I loved reading about that. I found it quite problematic because it felt to me like a fairly glib take on a period in history and a place that actually went through some fairly horrific events, and there was an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering that went on, and really that's only alluded to in the lightest way,
right?
Because the Count is sort of insulated in this hotel, and the hotel continues to function as a luxury establishment.
Was there such a real life figure as the Count?
I don't know. No, I don't think he was based on a real person, but the hotel was definitely...
Okay.
The hotel, almost as a character, is a real character.
Do you think I should keep reading it?
Yes, I do. Because in the end, I did enjoy it, and I found I missed it, actually. Okay. When I stopped reading it, I found I really missed it. And in fact, I'm now reading The Rules of Civility.
I can't believe you don't like it.
No, but which I'm enjoying more, because now I feel like I know, oh, okay, this is the kind of thing. I just have to be a bit patient with it and see where he goes with this.
Yeah, I love The Rules of Civility, almost in like a guilty pleasure kind of way.
Yeah.
Because it's set in 1920s New York, and there's these 2 beautiful, glamorous women, and then there's this, wealthy hostess kind of character, and it's just very finely crafted, and the wealthy boyfriend figure, and there's a love triangle. It's kind of melodramatic, but you love it because it's so well written. It feels like you're reading something literary, except you also get all of the good stuff too.
Yes, isn't that good? It's sort of literary but light.
Yes.
If you're after literary but light.
Can't
recommend Amor Towles highly enough. I've also been reading a book that I tried to pitch to book club, and I made the mistake of telling them that it's a 200-page novel, and I made the mistake of telling them that it was one long sentence.
Oh, wow.
At which they all threw up their hands in horror and said that they didn't want to read it. But it's called Solar Bones by Mike McCormack. It got quite a bit of press. It won the Irish Book of the Year award, I think, last year. And I had, again, just sort of heard a few things about it. I thought, oh, it sounds... And actually, it is quite amazing. It's beautifully written. And the funny thing about that conceit of this sentence is that you don't notice when you're reading it. You don't actually notice. Makes you realise, in some ways, perhaps punctuation is less relevant than we thought, because it doesn't matter. He gets spaces in through using paragraphs and does it that way. And it becomes much more that sense of a stream of consciousness, of thought. And I'm loving the sense of inhabiting the main character as a man who has worked all his life as an engineer, and just, inhabiting his thoughts. It felt quite, Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, that kind of stream of consciousness
that made me
thing.
when you said that, it made me think of that.
But interestingly written by a man and a man's perspective.
Isn't that kind of like Ulysses?
I haven't read Ulysses. Is it like Ulysses?
I think so.
Well, there you go then.
Even though Ulysses isn't
So I'm
just
tapping
one
into-
perspective. It isn't one perspective. It dips in and out.
Without even
and I've never
realising it.
finished it. I mean, let's be honest. I've probably...
Well, you've done more than me. I've never even started it.
But yeah, so and if it's an Irish author, he's also kind of following in very good footsteps.
Yeah. So
His countrymen.
I would recommend that. I haven't finished it yet, but I suspect it would make a good book club book, because it's packed with interesting ideas about unexpected things like economics and politics, and the question of Irish economic development and how people are affected in a kind of micro level to what's going on, in the sort of wider world around them. And that was very surprising. You're not quite sure what you're going to get next, but I'm really enjoying following the threads of this man's thoughts. So Solar Bones, yes, recommended.
And what is the Bailie Gifford Prize?
So Philippe Sands, East West Street, was the winner of the 2017 Bailie Gifford Prize. Bailie Gifford, really depressingly, turned out to be a sort of hedge fund or investment.
Really?
No, they're an investment fund manager.
A classy hedge
But
fund
previously,
manager.
it was known as the Samuel Johnson Prize. And
Oh,
when you look
well,
back
that's a shame.
through the list, it's been going since 1999. And when you look back through the list of prize winners, it's either, well, in my case, I've read probably 5 or 6 of them, and every single Johnson Prize book I've read, or Bailie Gifford Prize, has been brilliant.
Yeah,
I love it because it's a really reliable prize. And even the ones I haven't read, when I read the little bios, I say, oh, that sounds great. I'd love to read that.
Is it non-fiction?
It's exclusively non-fiction. Yeah, it's a prize for non-fiction writing. If you like non-fiction, I just think it's such a great way of ferreting out some really, really fantastic books.
Oh,
It's
brilliant.
unlike the Booker, which I always feel so frustrated. It feels
Yeah.
so subjective, that prize. You never know from one year to the next what you're going to get. The Bailie Gifford Prize, to my mind, is an incredibly reliable indicator of quality. H is for Hawk, one.
Oh, yeah.
Stasi-Land, Anna Funder's memoir about life in East Germany. Barbara Demick's book about North Korea that I thought was amazing. I thought that was an extraordinary book. That was a winner. So, yeah, really good list.